as it's, yeah, cool. So it's here, my name's Tom Coupland. I'm here from Nokia Entertainment Bristol, and I'm going to talk to you a bit today about MongoDB and how we came along and sort of decided we liked it, what our justification for it was, and then how we sort of convinced and got our organisation on board and got it coming in, and yeah, and what we sort of learned a little bit along the way. So a bit of context first, it's always required. So in Bristol, we're about 150 odd people, about 40 odd developers, and our part in Nokia is to develop the music application that's up here. So we, as sort of Java developers there, we work on the service-oriented architecture that sits behind the clients. So all the phones have this on them, and they all talk through to our services that are there in the background. So I mentioned there we've got a service-oriented architecture. What that kind of creates for us is lots of small pieces of software that each have their own sort of distinct persistence kind of needs. So, and they're also very specific because they're quite fine-grained as well. So we know what these little things have to do, and yeah, they're quite well contained. So previously, we were all just using MySQL. And some of us began to sort of have a bit of trouble with this. We were struggling with our schema changes, flexibility, and stuff like this. So if we look at sort of what our applications looked like before we started doing this, you can see we've got the phone there, over on the left. And they would talk to our services via JSON. So it's HTTP, REST, JSON that we use between all our services and to wire everything together. And then we've got our Java there in the middle with a coffee cup. And then I've got this sort of rigid, kind of boxy structure that goes down to MySQL. And that's the closest thing I could sort of image I could find that represented what tables and all the relations between them is like. So you see we've got this sort of free-flowing sort of form, and then it all has to be boxed up into containers and put in MySQL. Our other sort of reasons for having trouble with this was where we also have some app-level sharding. So we have some big data sets as well, as you can imagine. And these sets need to be sharded out across many nodes. And anyone who's implemented EJB3, Hibernate, JPA style in your application to shard across many nodes knows that it's not a great deal of fun, and it's a great way of spending an enormous amount of your time not actually delivering anything and just looking at Hibernate code and generally being upset with the people that made you use it in the first place. So, but we've also got this sort of mismatch here between what we've got coming in and what we're storing our stuff as well. So we've got JSON coming in, boxing it all up, putting it in MySQL, and then when someone wants it, we get it back out of MySQL, unpack it into JSON, and then give it back to them. So when you sort of think about this, you sort of realise, well, that sounds like a giant waste of time. And if we could just have JSON coming in, and then just stick JSON in storage, and then get it back out and send it back to the user, all our lives might suddenly become a bit easier. And we could, again, get back to that important factor of our jobs, which is actually delivering things. So, as I describe it, you can see that we probably started thinking about Mongo quite easily. There's quite a big buzz around it. It also seemed to fit our pattern quite well, with the JSON being stored directly in there. It also has that sort of sharding, sort of pre-made into it, which you can utilize as much as you want, well, very easily, without the headaches that we were experiencing at that time. So it also gets rid of our lovely schemas changes, which none of us really enjoyed. So we decided we're going to go for it. So the first phase, whenever you're going to adopt a new technology, is the experimentation phase. So we dressed up like this and got all our toys out and tried to think about little problems that we had going on that we could perhaps use Mongo for just to get our education level up. So we used it as like a backup store where we just dumped loads of metrics that we were investigating with, and then we also used it as a queue manager where we had like 15 million entities that all need processing, hundreds of CPUs that were all pulling things in and off the queue. So we used it for that. And this is where some of the things started to really shine through, like the dynamic schemering. So we started queuing lots of stuff. It wasn't quite right, so we changed it, and then we changed back. And all the time there's sort of that effort you have to go through to plan these things kind of disappeared a little bit. You could argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but here it was definitely a good thing, and we really got a lot of advantage from it. Also with the experimentation, it kind of takes the shine off it a little bit. You know, when you read about it, sometimes you can think these things are silver bullets and all you have to do is install it and all your problems will go away. It's not quite like that with any tool, unfortunately. So doing these started encountering some sort of first step problems. So we had problems with MapReduce jobs running aggregates over the entire queue to work out how fast things were moving through it. You do that with Mongo, whilst you've also got lots of clients coming at it. You realise that MapReduce really shouldn't be used like that. And we'd see these sort of flat lines in the throughput graphs. So this was sort of an excuse for us to start looking at the replica set stuff. So again, we sort of felt a need, fired up a replica, copied it over, and got us through those sort of first phases of working out how to do these things. And you know, again, it's just about educating yourself, but with a sort of real purpose as well. So after all these experiments and stuff, we went ahead and we decided that we wanted this. So as sort of 3 or 4 developers in the organisation decided they want to use a new tool. The next phase you've got to do is you've got to convince everybody else. There's a lot of other people involved. There's a lot of architects, various other managers and stuff, particularly operations guys who aren't comfortable with developers just installing new databases whenever they want and just messing around. Basically, they like to have decisions about things. So we started the next phase of our adoption, which is Project Stalking. So we consciously set out to look for any projects that were coming down the pipeline of work to do and tried to figure out whether they'd be a good fit for Mongo, whether we could justify the usage enough that we would be able to have enough momentum and get going that we could get using it. And there's actually a sort of a key phrase that we were looking out for. So, when you're designing new services and new data sets, there's always that point in the conversation where you start designing your relational schema. And it's one of those really fun meetings that you always look forward to in a new service. How are we going to model this in MySQL? So what we realized would be a really kind of, something to look out for is if anyone ever said in one of these meetings, well, there's some flexible data there, we're not quite sure what's going to be in it. So why don't we just sort of store a blob of XML in MySQL, and then that will solve all the problems, and that can have various different settings in it, and it will be fine. Putting to the side the fact that that's pretty much a terrible idea for performance reasons and several others, this phrase, when someone said it, is a trigger to think maybe Mongo might be a good fit here because of the schema flexibility. So if you've got entities coming in you want to store, and you're not quite, there's a variable set of settings that might be on them, and you're intending, and you're going to grow this set, but also they're not necessarily going to be interacting with each other very much, then that's a really good use case for Mongo, because each document, is separate from the others. So you don't have to set in stone what those settings are going to be. Other things we're looking out for which may sound a bit strange, was a good deadline. We wanted to make sure that this wasn't like a slow adoption or a sort of background task. We wanted to find something that needed to be done, and needed to be done relatively soon. Again, this injects us with good momentum. Now, obviously, we found one, otherwise this talk would be pretty short. So we found one, and we all got very excited, and we had some good meetings with people about why we're going to do it. But one of the things we have at Nokia Bristol is the technical community. So this is where all the developers get together. There are more of us than that, but not all of them wanted to be in the photo that gets projected up on the screen. So we all got together, and this is where those of us that were enthusiastic decided that we were going to lay out the argument for it, essentially. And there was actually 2 of us. And the things we went through were we sort of went through the problems of what we had going on with what we currently had, but we also wanted to not just sort of sell Mongo as being awesome and what we've currently got is rubbish, but actually sort of tease it apart a little bit and sort of justify it a bit more. But we did go through what we've got at the moment. Everyone was having trouble with the schema changes that we were suffering, and no one could really see the point in going on with those. The indexing system, so we have background indexing on Mongo, which is very nice. And there's also this key point about how much mapping code we had. So when we take apart these services, as I said, they're quite fine-grained, they're quite small. And you realise that most of what they do is taking stuff in, mapping it into some objects, a little bit of business logic, and then another big whack of transformation code going back out the other side. So one of our arguments was, well, if we've got the same going out the other end as we've got coming in the front, we can do away with quite a lot of these problems. It also, as hesitant to say, obviously, it would allow us to get rid of Hibernate, which was absorbing a great deal of our time at that point. Not just with the sharding, but the amount of time it takes to stand any of these things up. And when you're not getting the payback for it, you're not really using these transactional abilities, you haven't got dynamic queries, it just feels like you're writing code for the sake of writing code, or you're just using Hibernate because everyone says you should use Hibernate. And really, when you look at what you're actually doing, you don't really need it. You can simplify these things away. There's also Mongo has a much simpler transactional model that's only goes over one document, one change. So, if you look at what you're doing and think about what you're doing, and you realise that you never use this ability to have these nice big transactions that span many operations, all you're doing is complicating your code for the sake of the tools you're using. It doesn't actually help you solve the problem that you're trying to solve. But we also acknowledge the limitations of Mongo. So as I just sort of hinted there, really, that you can't join across these documents. The transactions aren't wide. And there's also, whenever you start looking at Mongo, you find a post that says, Mongo's not consistent, it doesn't write data to the database when it says it has. Which, one of our DBAs, Julie, put out their hand and made that wonderful point. That's an excuse to go through and explain about write concerns and things like this, where you can control this. In fact, you can control it to a very fine grain. And it's just not the problem that people sort of thought it was. We also sort of solved the idea, the magic hammer problem that we had. Obviously, we were using MySQL for everything. It was our magic golden hammer, and that's just not a good idea. So we wanted to broaden our persistence types. So we had the conversation, we had the justification. It actually came down to a vote of everybody, and again we won. Otherwise, the talk would end here. So at the end of that, we formed a Tiger Skunk team, a Tiger Skunk steering leveraging team, I think, to give it its full management name. And this was, again, another sort of interesting aspect of Mongo, that we were able to just do this as developers. So we formed our team, and we just included like 3 or 4 developers that were on the team building the system. And then we tried to bring in as many operational staff people as possible, because these are the guys that get buzzed when things go wrong, and you need those guys on your side when you're introducing these things. Keeping it small also allowed us to move fast, make decisions, just within ourselves, and avoid the kind of death by committee decision making that can be a bit of a drag. We also painted the project as something that didn't need a lot of management, something we could manage ourselves, and we knew that if we could do this and successfully bring it on, then we'll have shown that we can handle new persistence types. Because I don't know what it's like in everyone else's organisations, but if there's been a long period where all they're using is one tool, there's a lot of inertia there, and people aren't quite prepared to give that up. They just want to just keep doing what they're doing, and they don't want to change their mind. And Mongo is a good one to kind of shake that up a little bit, because you can come up with really good use cases for it, and when you justify them and get the agreement, you've started shaking things a little bit, and you can. It gives you the opportunity for other things, which I'll come on to a little bit later. So, it's a developer operations mixed Tiger Skunk team, but obviously each of those 2 aspects have their own concerns when it comes to using any sort of database. So you've got the operations guys. So these are the guys that worry about uptimes in the middle of the night. These are the guys that want to know about high availability. Some people may think some developers might not worry about this sort of stuff, but when you're talking about new persistent storage methods, these are the things you've got to worry about. And this is actually where another aspect of Mongo really sort of paid dividends for us. Because if you ever got it out and given it a little play, you'll realise how easy it is to configure and set up and show people. So what we would do is we'd get the whole team into a room, and we would just configure replica sets and sharding setups. And I highly recommend doing this, just getting everyone there who's got a kind of concern in this going forward, or is worried about it, or they haven't, they're not convinced yet. And when you get them in a room and you sit down with it and you show them how to do it, they very quickly come round to it, it's very easy to show people the kind of the command line interface to the database, configuring the replica sets and going through all that with people. You can just do it by just sat having a cup of tea. So we actually sort of group configured our sort of testing replica sets and our sharding setups. And they also, obviously the operations guys come through with sort of concerns that we kind of don't think about too much. Things, backing these things up, where do the backups go, how do you do it, all the sort of stuff that just needs to work, and you don't really want to worry about too much. And this is, in the end, Mongo stores its stuff in files, so there's no big difference there. It's quite easy to do. They'll already have a method to do this. But perhaps the more interesting for you guys is the development side of that equation. So, we're the guys pouring the iron and setting the shapes and stuff. So, when you're taking on your new database and you're suffering from a hibernate burn, as I like to call it, you come to Mongo and you start finding out all about ODMs. It's not ORMs anymore, it's ODMs. And everyone wants you to use an ODM, object document mapper, because you've got ORMs, why wouldn't you have ODMs? It'll be just as easy and simple to use as the ORMs, I'm sure. So we went through and we looked at things like Spring Data, and there's another project called Morphia. And we started sort of building some prototypes. And what we were, when we came to Mongo, what we really wanted was simplicity. We wanted to ease our development. Not, irresponsibly, but we wanted to make our daily working lives easier so we could develop more features and not spend all our time working on tools and configuring tools. Because, as great as tools are, you've got to make sure you've got the tool at the right level. There's no point in bringing in these massive things if all you're doing is, half a dozen or 10 tables. You just don't need a massive tool managing this for you. You can do it yourself. So when we came to Mongo and we started reading Spring Data, Morphia, etc., we pretty quickly decided that we didn't want that. We were kind of sick of this. We wanted to have control of what we were doing. And we wanted to know exactly what was going on with the database. We want to know what the queries are. We don't want them magicked away for us. We've got to know what they are so we can tune them properly. So we did what all good developers do. When they decide not to use something that's already available, we built our own, because that's what you do. And after a week of building our own, that was great fun, we realized again that we just kind of walked straight into the same trap, right? We didn't want to use Spring Data and Morphia because they sort of hid things and did it, and then we went straight off and built something that hid things and sort of did some magic for us. So that was a very fun conversation for some of us. There are some more realistic reasons why we didn't use these tools. They, in that weight, you do get lots of abilities. Polymorphic collections, binary types. You can have the fields in your objects different to the fields in Mongo. These are great features, but if you're not going to have polymorphic collections and you're just going to keep the same name so that everything's readable and you can transfer between the data and your objects easily, then what is the point in bringing a tool that gives you those things? You may as well just keep it much, much simpler. So we literally had a conversation one day where our own rolled thing was coming along and it was all, was all looking great, and we hadn't quite had the realization that we'd just totally made the same mistake we were trying to avoid in the first place. When we realized that we already had something that converted JSON into objects, and it was sat at the front of our services, converting our JSON REST requests into our request objects. We've got Jackson there doing that work for us already. So why were we trying to build our own new one? We already had one, and it was sat right there. So with a little bit of a messing around, we just plugged Jackson in there, and it worked fine. Surprise, surprise. We did find one of our goals was sort of to have just data flowing backwards and forwards, and we sort of had this idea that we could just, what came in, we could just shoot back. But really, if you're talking that simple, then you want to be using a key value store, because if you're not actually doing anything with your data, or you're not searching through it in any sort of complicated way, then you just use a key value store, and it's even simpler. But we did have a few more requirements that meant that wasn't quite an option for us. A few different queries and stuff. We want users of certain types and things like this, which made us sort of go with the Mongo. So that meant that we did actually end up with two models. We've got a front model and a back model. And although we could have used the Jackson view annotations to have different views of different things, again, it didn't hit that point of simplicity that we were after, which is actually our driving force through all of this. It's just we want simplicity. We want to be able to look at our system and understand it quickly. We want to be able to describe it to new people quickly and have them grasp it. We don't want to have to describe half a dozen tools to a new developer so that they can start working on these things. Keep it nice and simple. So we didn't use that. So after we did that, it was time to test our systems. So again, this is where we sort of used our skunk tiger team. And we all got in a room and we fired up various JMeter nodes and got them talking to each other. And we just hammered it as much as we could, while some other people helpfully went around turning off various boxes just to see what it was like. See what the actual replication set failover really was, not just what it says in the documentation, but what it's actually like for us when this is really going to happen in the middle of the night one day. And again, this is getting the devs and the ops together to do this is invaluable because it demystifies it a little bit for these guys. They get used to reading the logs about what's going to happen in those logs. So when that call does come in and that guy does get woken up, he's familiar with these things already, and you've gone through this process before. And it's just that sort of getting used to the fact that this stuff happens. And it's a great way to educate people about the tool as well. I can see some of my slides have been deleted. That's not what you want to find out. Okay, so the sky's the limit is the name on this slide, but there's actually a slide in between that's about metrics. So the other thing that we did during this process was we wrote a little Python script that we've actually got up on GitHub that just polls Mongo for its stats and just shoves them all into Graphite. And I would say that if you haven't got this kind of ability to sort of be looking at what your app's doing in live on a per sort of resource basis and all that and have it all in a nice graphing system, that's definitely your first point of call. Because without that sort of information, you really can't be measuring how things are going and what the changes are like. So it would be helpful to have that slide. But yeah, so we wrote our own little script. It gets deployed out on all the Mongos and generates all the metrics that we then monitor on, and this is where our alerting systems come in. So again, this is another aspect you have to sort of think about. So where are we going with our Mongo adoption? Well, the sky's the limit. We're eyeing up our bigger data sets. We've got sets with billions of rows and things. There's some big stuff there that we're looking at maybe moving over, and especially with regards to the sharding and deleting quite a lot of very complicated Hibernate EJB code and just getting rid of all of that and pushing it all down into the database. And I'm very much looking forward to that day, having written quite a lot of that code myself. We've also found that this quick development cycle that you have with Mongo, where all the developers can just play with it. People can just download it and be going. We'd find people who had set up whole sharding systems on their laptops in half an hour just because they wanted to find out what it was like. And that's actually very useful. That's not something you see people doing with MySQL. People just genuinely finding it interesting and going for it. There are some other benefits to having introduced this, actually. I was talking about sort of shaking up your organization a little bit. Once you've got one of these experiments done and in, you've broken that mindset where we just use this tool. This is what we do. We use MySQL, and every time something comes up, that's what we're going to do. When you've busted that, every time something comes up, there's a new element to the conversation. Instead of just having a schema design conversation, you have a persistence type conversation. And that's where things get very interesting, because you get people thinking about this question again, which some people, you might be surprised to hear, haven't thought about for quite a while. And again, this comes back to this idea of just thinking through what you actually need, not just pulling as many tools as you can get your hands on and stuffing them in a box. Thinking very carefully about each one, what it's going to bring, but not just what you want from it, but also what extra does it bring, all that other fluff that's in there. Do you actually need all that fluff? If you're not going to use it, you are probably going to have to understand quite a bit of it to use that tool, or you are going to encounter it. So you might be better off just not having it at all. So yeah, so it's opened the gateway to experimentation for us. And we've got some other things coming along. So it's opened up the ability for us to have some new JVM languages worked in. Again, following this idea of simplicity, which was our driving force in the beginning. And other storage types, Neo4j, and other things like that. So I've managed to do it pretty much in time. So that's it. I've got 3 minutes for questions. So thanks for listening. Any questions? Yeah.
Now that you said you dismissed Morphia, and then you went about kind of recreating Morphia. If you had it to do over again, would you consider using Morphia again? Not have your own code that you're supporting?
Well, we didn't end up using our own. Sorry, the question was, when we sort of wrote our own solution, would we think, instead of going back to Morphia, rather than carrying on with our own? But we didn't actually end up using our own at all. We got rid of that too, and just used the Jackson mappings between the JSON back and forwards. So, no, we've just not felt the need for anything like that. Yeah.
Do you do any validation with the JSON, or to directly put it into the MongoDB?
It gets mapped inside the application. So we have JSON schema at the front, so we know what's come in. Sorry, the question was, do you validate anything that goes into Mongo at the back? So we validate what comes in at the front and map it inside. So the application knows the form of the documents that are in Mongo. So we don't sort of feel the need for another layer of validation there at the moment. Anything else? Well, if anyone thinks of anything, I'm going to be around all week. Feel free to come and ask me any questions you want. Cool. Thanks.